What lurks beneath Pennsylvania's quiet streets. Welcome back to Unheard Fears. Tonight, 9 encounters from small towns where darkness thrives in silence. These stories are real. Names and certain details have been altered to protect privacy, but the terror remains unchanged. From coal country to forgotten highways, witness what happens when normalcy shatters. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop your location in the comments. If these stories unsettle you, smash that like button, subscribe, and share your own encounters below. Let's begin. My name is Colton, and I never imagined one of America's most notorious ghost towns would become the site of my strangest and possibly final job as a night shift security guard. In October 2015, I was desperate enough to accept work at the old St. Ignatius Hospital in Centralia, Pennsylvania, an abandoned relic perched near the coal fire zone where the land has burned beneath the earth for decades. It might sound reckless, but with rent weeks overdue and no family and state, every dollar counted. The town itself was mostly deserted. Roads buckled in places. Fog curled out from the forest line. Streetlights flickered even after the local council swore the wiring had been shut off for years. Most people only visit Centralia once for a thrill, but I started coming back every night, bracing myself for the silence. Except for the hospital itself, with its chipped white paint and broken windows, an old security desk, and a string of dark corridors lined with empty wheelchairs, as if still waiting to be pushed by some invisible force. It was just me and the security cameras, at least for the first week. The job itself seemed simple. Walk the halls every hour, make a round past the old ER, check the main floor for trespassers bored enough to break into a ruin. The hospital locked from the inside. You'd think I was safe, but places like Centralia have their own logic. The 6th night, I noticed something odd. When flipping between security feeds, the camera that faced the old surgery wing showed 3 people in the hallway, just silhouettes gliding past. I blinked hard and looked out from my desk. You guessed it, empty, just as usual. I told myself it was a video glitch, or maybe some residue burnt onto the old tape. The next morning, I reviewed the timestamp and nearly froze. The camera showed the familiar corridor, but now the 3 silhouettes walked in crisp black and white, their clothing like something out of a mid-century photograph. Nurses in white hats and dresses, an orderly holding a mop. When I returned to the main desk, someone had placed a schedule board in the corner, dusty but with fresh handwriting. It listed surgeries dated in October 1952, appointments for people who should have long since left this world. Chalk dust clung to my hands when I touched the board, but the handwriting wasn't my own. On the 7th night, I lost track of time examining the old ledgers, trying to find some link between the names appearing on the schedule and actual hospital history. Miles, a younger maintenance worker from the next town over, came in at midnight to drop off some replacement bulbs for the 4th floor. I didn't mention the camera glitches, but he seemed on edge anyway, muttering about how echoes followed him up the main stairs and how he'd heard someone singing an old hymn. I brushed it off. I wish I hadn't. Later that evening, I heard the strange singing myself. It came from behind a locked door that led to an unused surgery suite. I leaned close and swore I heard the murmur of a prayer, then the hard snap of rubber-soled shoes, a sound too precise for so many years of dust. That weekend, I found myself compelled to dig further, prying open supply closets and flipping through brittle stacks of faded paperwork shoved behind the security desk. The hospital always had a strange antiseptic odor overlaying the current decay, as though the air itself was layered in decades. The sense of displacement grew stronger. The chalkboard updated itself, new names every day. Shadows moved on the walls before the sun went down, morphing as the light changed. I kept convincing myself these were just quirks of working alone, but by Sunday, reality didn't seem fixed at all. Past and present started merging as I reached the camera room near the old ER. One sleepless night, I wandered through the main corridor and saw, to my horror, my own figure reflected on the security monitor. But it wasn't me exactly. It was someone wearing a heavy wool coat and rounded badge, uniform style from the 1950s, moving in a pattern identical to my own. The skin on my arms prickled, as though the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a heartbeat. When the doppelganger turned to face the camera, the screen flickered, and a sharp rush of hospital disinfectant hit my nose, as though the air was being replaced with another era's atmosphere. My heart hammered so violently, I nearly blacked out. On my final night, wanting to prove to myself all of it was a sleep-deprived hallucination, I decided to film with my own equipment. I arranged my cell phone beside the old monitors and waited. As midnight drew closer, the lights in my corridor failed one after the other. Only the ghostly blue glow of the camera feeds lit up the desk. I felt the chills sink into my bones. Each breath was tinged with chemical cold, an unmistakable antiseptic metallic tang. When the monitors flickered again, the entire schedule board rearranged itself. Names vanished, new ones appeared. Patients who were marked as discharged reappeared with new surgeries. Down the hallway, I watched Miles. He shouldn't have been there, but he was, walking past with his maintenance gear, though I knew he'd gone home hours earlier. My own name flashed on the board, paired beside the date 1952, as though I'd always been scheduled for this night, in this building, caught in some repeating loop. I tried to run, but the corridor stretched longer than I remembered. Every step echoed as if I was both walking and being watched by dozens of unseen eyes. Behind me, footsteps multiplied in number, some heavy, some light, but all belonging to people not present. I slammed open the main doors and ran straight into the dense Centralia fog, lungs burning with the taste of smoke and chemicals. I left everything, my jacket, my keys, even my phone, inside that building, because all I could think about was escape. 3 days later, the hospital burned to the ground in a freak accident nobody could explain, and firefighters found no trace of any security equipment, no monitors, no desk, nothing I had used in my week of work. Miles never responded to my calls again. It was as if he vanished along with the remnants of that place. Centralia kept its fires burning beneath the earth, and St. Ignatius vanished from the town's memory. Sometimes I wake up gasping, my skin slick with sweat, convinced I glimpsed myself through a camera lens set in another decade. I still taste hospital dust and antiseptic on the back of my tongue when I remember those nights, and the cold biting my skin whenever I walk alone in dim corridors. Whenever someone asks why I left security work for good, I tell them it's simple. Some buildings aren't haunted in the way you think. They're traps, repeating past lives, waiting for someone new to join their eternal rounds. My name is Biba, and I've been teaching elementary school for almost 12 years, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered when I moved to Ravens Creek, Pennsylvania in July 2022. The town looked picture-perfect when I first drove down Main Street. White picket fences, a hardware store that still had the original 1940s sign, and kids riding bikes without helmets, like time had stopped, somewhere around 1985. I'd taken the job at Ravens Creek Elementary because the pay was surprisingly good for such a small district, and the principal, a cheerful woman who interviewed me over video call, promised a welcoming community and well-behaved students. What she didn't mention was the massive oak tree that dominated the school playground, its twisted branches spreading so wide they cast shadows across half the blacktop even at noon. The tree had to be at least 200 years old, its trunk so thick 4 adults couldn't wrap their arms around it, bark scarred and knotted like old flesh. I noticed it immediately during my first walk around campus, but what struck me most was how the children avoided it completely. During recess on my second day, I watched as kids ran, shouted, played tag, and hopscotch, but none of them went within 20 feet of that oak. It was as if an invisible barrier surrounded it, and even the rubber balls that bounced toward its roots were abandoned rather than retrieved. By late August, as the school year officially started, I began asking questions. The other teachers changed the subject whenever I brought up the tree. Parents smiled politely during meet and greet night, but deflected when I mentioned how odd it seemed that such a beautiful tree went unused for climbing or shade. Then September arrived, and with it came the preparation for what everyone called the Harvest Gratitude Ceremony. Flyers went home with students, permission slips were signed, and suddenly the tree I'd been curious about became the center of intense activity. Families donated items, small toys, handwritten notes, coins, ribbons, and students were encouraged to bring their own offerings. I was told it was a town tradition dating back generations, a way to teach gratitude and community bonding. It sounded innocent enough until I stayed late one afternoon and decided to examine the tree more closely. At its base, partially hidden by overgrown roots, was a hollow opening about 3 feet wide. I shone my phone's flashlight inside, and my stomach turned. The hollow descended deep into the earth, and piled within were hundreds, maybe thousands of objects. Action figures from the 1980s, dolls with missing eyes, rusted pocket watches, baby teeth tied with string, handwritten prayers on yellowed paper, photographs of children I didn't recognize. The smell that rose from the hollow was sickly sweet, like flowers rotting in summer heat, mixed with something else I couldn't identify but made my eyes water. I brought my concerns to Xavier, the school janitor who'd worked at Ravens Creek Elementary for 30 years. He was a quiet man, always polite, someone who kept to himself while mopping floors and emptying trash bins. When I cornered him in the supply closet and asked directly about the tree, his expression shifted to something between pity and fear. He locked the door, made me promise not to repeat what he was about to say, then explained in a hushed voice that the town's prosperity wasn't luck or good planning. It was directly tied to the offerings given to the tree each September. He told me that in 1987, the town council voted to skip the ceremony, calling it superstitious nonsense that had no place in modern education. Within 2 weeks, 3 children vanished from the school playground during recess. No bodies were ever found, no suspects identified, and the cases remained unsolved to this day. The following September, the ceremony resumed with twice the usual offerings, and Ravens Creek returned to its peaceful existence. Xavier's hands trembled as he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, and he warned me not to interfere, not to question, not to break the tradition. When I asked what would happen if someone refused to participate, he simply shook his head and walked away. I couldn't let it go. The rational part of my brain insisted this was mass delusion, a town clinging to folklore out of coincidence and fear. But then my students started getting sick. First, it was just sniffles and coughs, normal for early fall, but by the 3rd week of September, half my classroom was absent. The school nurse had no explanation. Blood tests came back normal. No viral infections detected, yet children complained of nightmares, stomach pains, and exhaustion so severe some couldn't get out of bed. The only students unaffected were those whose families had already made their offerings to the tree. I watched from my classroom window as parents arrived after school hours, walking solemnly to the oak with their children in tow, placing objects into the hollow while whispering words I couldn't hear. Some children cried, clinging to the toys they were forced to leave behind. Others stared at the tree with blank expressions, as if under some trance. The night before the official ceremony, I returned to the school alone, determined to document what I'd discovered and report it to authorities outside Ravens Creek. The September moon hung full and heavy, casting silver light across the empty playground. As I approached the oak, I heard it, a low humming sound, rhythmic and ancient like a heartbeat amplified through wood and earth. The bark felt warm under my palm, almost feverish, and I swear I felt something pulse beneath the surface. Then the hollow began to shift. The piled offerings moved slightly, rearranging themselves as if stirred by invisible hands, and for just a moment, the bark split open wider, revealing something moving deep inside the trunk. It wasn't wood or insects or roots. It was something alive, something that had been waiting and feeding for longer than the town had existed. I stumbled backward, my phone slipping from my hands and cracking against the ground, and ran to my car without looking back. The next day, September 23rd, the entire school gathered for the Harvest Gratitude Ceremony. I was required to attend, to stand with the other teachers and smile as children placed their offerings into the hollow, while the principal read from a prepared script about community and tradition. I watched Xavier standing near the back, his face gray and resigned, and I understood then that everyone knew, everyone had always known, but speaking the truth meant risking everything. As the last child placed a small wooden horse into the hollow, the oak's branches shifted despite the windless air, and for the briefest second, I saw faces in the bark, children's faces, dozens of them, pressed against the wood from the inside as if trapped beneath the surface. The ceremony concluded with applause, and parents hugged their children with visible relief, as if a great burden had been lifted. That afternoon, every sick child in my classroom returned, suddenly healthy, energetic, and smiling. No one mentioned their illnesses. No one questioned the recovery. I submitted my resignation in October, citing family reasons, and left Ravens Creek before Halloween. The school district offered me a generous severance package on the condition I sign a non-disclosure agreement about anything I'd observed during my employment. I signed it because I wanted out, because I couldn't bear another September in that town, watching children feed something that should never have existed. I learned later that my replacement, a young teacher fresh out of college, lasted only until the following spring. Her daughter, enrolled in the school's kindergarten program, went missing during an April field day. The official report said she wandered into the woods and was never found, but I know better. I know where she is, trapped inside that oak, her face pressed against the bark, waiting for the next harvest. Sometimes I wake up tasting bark dust and rotting flowers, and I wonder if leaving was enough, or if the tree remembers those who refuse to feed it. Do you think some traditions exist for reasons beyond superstition, or is there always a rational explanation hiding beneath the fear? My name is Adam, and I've worked as a radio technician for 15 years, troubleshooting everything from cell tower interference to old AM broadcast equipment scattered across rural Pennsylvania. In March 2018, I got a call from the Bradford County Emergency Management Office about a mysterious signal causing problems throughout the Wyalusing area. Police radios were picking up strange static bursts. Local AM stations reported their frequencies being overridden at random intervals, and even some residents claimed their baby monitors and garage door openers were acting erratically. The county offered decent pay for what seemed like a straightforward job: trace the interference, identify the source, shut it down. I drove up Route 6 on a cold Tuesday morning, the kind of gray March day where fog clings to the Susquehanna River Valley and makes everything look washed out and ghostly. Wyalusing itself was one of those Pennsylvania towns that peaked sometime around 1950 and never quite recovered, with a main street full of empty storefronts and houses that needed paint jobs they'd probably never get. The emergency management coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Atlas, who worked out of a cramped office above the post office, handed me a folder full of complaint reports and a map marked with red X's indicating where the interference was strongest. She mentioned that the problems had started about 6 weeks earlier, always between midnight and 4 in the morning, and that several elderly residents were genuinely frightened because the static seemed to form patterns that almost sounded like voices speaking backward. I set up my equipment that first night in a vacant lot on the north edge of town, my van loaded with spectrum analyzers, directional antennas, and recording devices that would log every frequency active in the area. The temperature dropped hard after sunset, my breath fogging in the dim light from my instrument panels, and around 12:30 I started picking up the signal. It came through on 1520 kilohertz, an old AM frequency that hadn't been licensed for broadcast in decades, and the moment I heard it through my headphones, my skin went cold. The static wasn't random. It had rhythm, structure, almost like Morse code but more complex, and underneath it I could hear what Atlas had described, a mechanical voice speaking words I couldn't quite make out because they were reversed or distorted in some way I'd never encountered in all my years working with radio equipment. I recorded 20 minutes of the signal and ran it through audio software, reversing the playback and filtering out layers of noise. And what I heard made me pull over on the side of Route 6 and sit in my van for 10 minutes trying to rationalize what couldn't be rationalized. The voice, when played backward and cleaned up, was reciting coordinates, latitude and longitude numbers, spoken in a flat, emotionless tone that repeated the same set of numbers 5 times before moving to a new set. The next morning, I met Atlas at a diner off Route 220 and played her the cleaned recording. She went pale, her coffee cup halfway to her mouth, and asked me to play it again. After the third listen, she admitted something she hadn't mentioned during our initial meeting. 3 people had gone missing from Bradford County in the past 6 weeks, all of them disappearing without a trace. No bodies found, no leads for the state police to follow. She pulled out her phone and showed me the missing persons reports, and I felt my stomach drop when I realized the dates of the disappearances aligned almost perfectly with when residents first reported the radio interference. I made a decision that probably wasn't smart but felt necessary. I was going to track down those coordinates and see what, if anything, was at those locations. Atlas tried to talk me out of it, said I should report everything to the state police and let them handle it. But I'd already plugged the first set of coordinates into my GPS, and they pointed to a spot less than 15 miles away, deep in the woods, off a logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. I drove out there just after noon, the March sun doing little to warm the dense forest that crowded both sides of the muddy road. When my GPS indicated I'd reached the coordinates, I parked and walked another 100 yards through wet leaves and deadfall until I found what I was looking for, a small clearing where the ground had been disturbed recently, dirt piled in a way that suggested something had been buried and then partially uncovered by animals or weather. I didn't dig. I'm not a cop and I'm not an idiot, but I took photos and marked the location on my map, then drove to the second set of coordinates. That location was even more remote, accessible only by hiking in from an old cemetery on the outskirts of Wyalusing. And when I reached the spot indicated by the reversed voice, I found a backpack wedged under a fallen log, its contents scattered by wildlife but still identifiable. A woman's wallet, a cell phone with a cracked screen, prescription medication bottles with a name that matched one of the missing persons on Atlas's list. The third set of coordinates led me to an abandoned farm where I found a man's jacket hanging on a fence post, pockets turned inside out, the fabric stained with something dark that I didn't want to examine too closely. I called Atlas from my van and told her everything I'd found, and within 2 hours, state police had marked all 3 locations as crime scenes. The investigation moved quickly after that. Forensic teams, search dogs, detectives interviewing everyone in Wyalusing who might have information. But none of that addressed the real question, the one that kept me awake at night. How did a radio signal predict where the belongings of missing people would be found? And more importantly, who or what was broadcasting that signal? I spent the next week tracing the source, using every piece of equipment I owned, and calling in favors from colleagues who had access to more sophisticated gear. The signal originated from an old AM radio tower about 5 miles southwest of Wyalusing, a rusted lattice structure that rose from a hilltop like a skeletal finger pointing at low clouds. The tower had been abandoned since the early 1990s, when the station that owned it went bankrupt, and according to county records, the property had changed hands 3 times, but was currently owned by some LLC that no one could track down. I hiked up to the tower on a rainy Thursday afternoon, my equipment bag heavy on my shoulder, and found the small cinder block building at the tower's base still powered somehow, a thick cable running from an old generator that chugged along despite having no visible fuel source. Inside the building, I found broadcast equipment that should have been obsolete decades ago, tube amplifiers, massive capacitors, a transmitter that belonged in a museum, all of it running, all of it hot to the touch and humming, with electrical current that made the hair on my arm stand up. I set up my recording gear and monitored the signal for 3 hours, documenting every transmission, and at exactly 4:17 in the afternoon, the signal changed. Instead of the usual reversed speech with coordinates, I heard something new, my own name, spoken clearly in that same mechanical voice, followed by a set of coordinates I recognized immediately because they were the exact location where I was standing. My hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped my recorder. The signal continued, repeating my name and those coordinates over and over, and I realized with a horror that made my chest tight and my breathing shallow that the broadcast was now predicting my own disappearance, placing me in the same category as the 3 missing people whose belongings I'd found scattered across Bradford County. I grabbed a fire axe from the emergency equipment mounted on the wall and destroyed everything I could reach. Smashed the transmitter, severed cables, shattered tubes that exploded in showers of glass and acrid smoke. The generator coughed and died. The humming stopped. And for a moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the rain drumming on the metal roof. I stumbled out of the building, my hands cut and bleeding from the broken equipment, and ran down the muddy trail to where I'd parked my van. I didn't stop driving until I was across the state line into New York. Didn't stop to eat or sleep until I'd put 300 miles between myself and that tower. Atlas called me 2 days later, said the state police had found the building burned to the ground, apparently struck by lightning during a storm the night after I'd destroyed the equipment, and that all the broadcast gear had been reduced to melted slag. She asked if I knew anything about it, and I lied. Said I'd left town before finishing my investigation because the job wasn't worth the county's payment. But here's the thing that still wakes me up at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat. The signal never stopped. 3 weeks after I left Pennsylvania, I was working a routine job in upstate New York and picked up a faint transmission on the same frequency, 15-20 kilohertz, just static, and that mechanical voice speaking coordinates in reverse. I didn't decode it. I didn't investigate. I packed up my equipment and drove home, and I haven't worked a radio interference case since. The 3 missing people from Bradford County were never found. Their cases remain open and unsolved. And sometimes when I'm scanning frequencies late at night, I hear fragments of that signal, always at the edge of audibility, always just clear enough to remind me that some broadcasts come from places that shouldn't exist and predict events that haven't happened yet but inevitably will. Have you ever heard something on the radio that you couldn't explain? A voice or pattern that felt like it was meant specifically for you? My name is Zia, and I never believed in ghosts until I spent a winter alone at the Eckley Miners Village Preservation Site in northeastern Pennsylvania. In November 1998, I was hired as a historical preservation worker, tasked with cataloging artifacts in the old coal mining company store that had been converted into a museum after the town became a heritage site. Eckley was a company town in the truest sense, built in 1854 by the coal operators who owned not just the mines but every building, every road, every scrap of land the miners and their families lived on. The company store was where miners bought their supplies on credit, accumulating debts that grew faster than their wages could cover, trapping entire families in cycles of poverty that lasted generations. When I arrived that gray November morning, the preservation coordinator handed me keys to the building and explained that I'd be working alone through the winter months because the site was closed to tourists until spring. She mentioned the heating system was unreliable and that I should bring warm clothes, but she didn't mention anything else. And looking back, I think she knew exactly what I was walking into, but chose not to warn me because good workers were hard to find, and the cataloging needed to be finished before the next funding review. The company store was a 2-story wooden structure with wide plank floors that creaked under my weight and windows that let in dim light even on sunny days. The first floor housed the main retail area with long wooden counters, glass display cases still filled with period merchandise, and shelves stocked with reproduction goods meant to show visitors what miners could buy: flour, coffee, tobacco, tools, fabric. The second floor contained storage and what had once been the bookkeeper's office, where ledgers going back to the 1860s were stacked in metal filing cabinets that smelled like rust and old paper. My job was to photograph every artifact, record its condition, cross-reference items with historical records, and create a digital database that would help the Preservation Society track their collection. It seemed straightforward enough, and the first week passed without incident. Just long, quiet days, measuring antique coffee grinders and writing descriptions of miners' lunch pails, while November wind rattled the windows and made the whole building groan like something alive. The cash register sat on the main counter near the front door, a massive brass and iron machine manufactured in 1902, according to the small metal plate riveted to its base. I noticed it on my third day because I was cataloging items in order from front to back, and when I approached it with my camera, I felt an uncomfortable chill that had nothing to do with the failing heating system. The register was beautiful in a mechanical way, all ornate scrollwork and numbered keys worn smooth from decades of use. But there was something about it that made me reluctant to touch it, as if it was waiting for something. That evening, just as the sun set and the store filled with long shadows, I heard it ring. The sound was sharp and clear, that distinctive bell-like ding of an old mechanical register, and the cash drawer slid open with a metallic scrape that echoed through the empty building. I walked over slowly, my heart beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, and looked inside the drawer. Where there should have been nothing but dust, I found 3 handwritten IOUs on yellowed paper, the ink faded brown but still legible. The notes were dated October through December 1902, written in a shaky hand that suggested someone barely literate, and they listed debts for flour, lamp oil, and children's shoes. The names on the IOUs meant nothing to me then, but each one ended with the same notation: balance carried forward, interest compounding weekly. I should have left right then, should have locked the door, and told the preservation coordinator I was done, but I convinced myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe the IOUs had been placed there by a previous worker as part of an exhibit. Maybe the register's mechanism had simply released due to temperature changes. I put the IOUs in a plastic archival sleeve and continued working, though I made sure to leave before sunset after that. The next evening, November 19th, I returned to find the register had rung again while the building was locked and empty overnight. This time there were 5 IOUs in the drawer, all dated from 1902, all documenting debts that exceeded the miners' weekly wages. I began researching the names in the historical ledgers stored upstairs, and what I found made the preservation work feel less like history and more like archaeology of suffering. The miners whose names appeared on those IOUs had died owing money to the company, 1 in a mine collapse, 2 from black lung disease, 1 from an infected injury that the company doctor had treated with whiskey and prayer. Their widows and children inherited the debts, which continued to grow with interest and late fees, binding entire families to the company for years after the original debtor had died. The ledgers were filled with similar entries, page after page documenting economic servitude dressed up as employment, and the careful bookkeeper's handwriting that recorded each transaction seemed to take pleasure in noting penalties and compounding interest. By early December, the cash register rang every evening at exactly 6:47, and each time I found more IOUs, sometimes a dozen or more, all from 1902, all documenting debts that had become unpayable. I started photographing the shelves at night before I left, using my digital camera to document the store's contents, and when I reviewed the images on my computer at home, I saw things that hadn't been visible to my naked eye. In the photographs, the store appeared occupied. Shadowy figures stood in the aisles, reached toward the shelves, pressed their faces against the glass cases, as if desperate for goods they couldn't afford. The figures were translucent, barely there, but distinct enough that I could see their clothing, the period work clothes and patched dresses of mining families from a century ago. In one photograph, a woman held a child's hand while pointing at a shelf of canned goods, her mouth open as if pleading for credit. In another, a man in miner's coveralls stood at the counter, his shoulders slumped in defeat, his hand extended as if offering something to an invisible clerk. The worst night came in mid-December, during a snowstorm that left Eckley isolated and silent under a blanket of white. I was working late, trying to finish photographing the second-floor storage area before the Christmas break, when the temperature inside the store dropped so suddenly I could see my breath in thick clouds. Downstairs, the cash register rang, but this time it didn't stop. It rang continuously, drawer opening and slamming shut in a mechanical rhythm that sounded almost frantic. I descended the stairs slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through darkness that felt thicker than normal, and when I reached the main floor, I experienced something I still can't fully explain or rationalize. The store had changed. Instead of the dim, dusty museum interior I'd been working in for weeks, I saw the company store as it had been in 1902, shelves fully stocked, lamps burning, the air warm and close with the smell of tobacco and coal dust and unwashed bodies. Behind the counter stood a thin man in a vest and sleeve garters, his face pinched and calculating as he wrote in a ledger with meticulous care. Miners and their families crowded the store, their voices a low murmur of desperate negotiation, and I realized I was watching them shop for goods they needed but couldn't afford, accumulating debts that would follow them to their graves and beyond. I stood frozen, watching the scene unfold like a movie playing on top of reality, and the worst part was that I could feel it, the hopelessness, the trapped sensation of owing more than you could ever repay, the knowledge that your children would inherit your debts and your grandchildren would still be paying interest on flour you bought in 1902. One of the miners turned to look directly at me, his face gray with coal dust and exhaustion, and his eyes held such profound despair that I felt tears run down my face. Then the cash register rang one final time, loud and final as a church bell, and the vision dissolved. I was alone in the dark store again, my flashlight flickering, the only sound my own ragged breathing, and the wind howling outside. I grabbed my coat and ran, leaving my camera and cataloging materials behind, and I drove through the snowstorm all the way back to Scranton without stopping. I called the preservation coordinator the next morning and quit, told her I'd had a family emergency and couldn't finish the contract. She didn't argue, just asked me to mail back the keys, and something in her tone suggested she'd expected this outcome. I mailed the keys along with a letter describing what I'd experienced, though I doubted she'd believe me or care. 2 weeks later, I received a package containing my camera and notebooks, along with a note that simply said the cataloging project had been postponed indefinitely, and they'd found someone else to complete it eventually. I never heard from the Preservation Society again, but I did research the company store's history more thoroughly, and what I learned kept me awake for nights afterward. The store's bookkeeper in 1902 had been a man named Easton, known for his strict accounting and refusal to forgive debts even when miners' families were starving. He'd kept the ledgers with obsessive care, documenting every penny owed, every interest charge applied, every payment that fell short. When he died in 1924, his estate included those ledgers, which he'd apparently kept in his private possession like trophies. The ledgers were donated to the Preservation Society in 1976, and according to archive records, every worker who'd been assigned to catalog them had quit within 6 months. most citing vague reasons or simply disappearing from the project without explanation. I still have the photographs I took, stored on a backup drive I keep in a locked drawer because I can't bring myself to delete them, but I never want to see them again. In the final image I captured, dated December 14th, you can see me standing in the store, flashlight in hand, but I'm not alone. Behind me, barely visible, in the dim light stands the bookkeeper, his ledger open, and if you zoom in far enough you can see he's writing something new. I never looked closely enough to read what he wrote, but later I found an old ledger page tucked into my camera bag, though I have no memory of taking it from the store. The page was dated 1902, but at the bottom, added in fresh ink that hadn't been there when the ledger was archived, was my name Zaya followed by my birth date, and next to it the notation, debtor's descendant, balance due, interest compounding in perpetuity. Have you ever felt like you were paying for mistakes made by people you never knew? Or does the past sometimes reach forward to collect debts that should have been forgiven long ago? My name is Jordan, and I've been driving long-haul trucks across the interstate system for 19 years, logging millions of miles between loading docks and distribution centers from California to Maine. In June 2023, I picked up a load in Pittsburgh, headed for Baltimore, a routine overnight run down I-70 that I'd made dozens of times before without incident. The route takes you through some of Pennsylvania's emptiest stretches, past shuttered factories and forgotten towns, and right through Breezewood, that odd little interchange where I-70 and I-76 meet in what locals call the town built on traffic. Breezewood exists because of a quirk in highway planning. Instead of a proper interchange, through traffic has to exit onto a surface street lined with gas stations, fast food restaurants, and truck stops before merging back onto the interstate. It's annoying if you're in a hurry, but for truckers, it's a convenient place to fuel up, grab coffee, and stretch legs before pushing through to the next destination. I pulled off I-70 around 2 in the morning, my eyes burning from staring at highway lines, and my back aching from 10 straight hours in the driver's seat. The truck stop was one of those massive places that never close, with diesel pumps under bright fluorescent lights, a restaurant that served breakfast 24 hours, and parking for 50 trucks scattered across cracked asphalt that probably hadn't been repaved since the 1990s. What caught my attention immediately was how familiar everything looked. Not familiar in the sense that I'd been there before, which I had, but familiar in an unsettling way that made my brain itch. 3 vehicles sat in the parking lot under the lights. A red pickup with Pennsylvania plates, a silver sedan with a cracked windshield, and a motorcycle with custom chromework. I'd seen those exact vehicles, in those exact parking spots earlier that evening, when I'd passed through Breezewood, heading east on I-70. That had been 6 hours ago, around 8 at night, and I'd made note of the motorcycle because you don't see many bikes on the road that late in the season. Now here they were again, parked in identical positions as if they'd never moved, or as if I'd somehow circled back without realizing it. I checked my GPS to confirm I was where I thought I was, and the screen showed Breezewood, mile marker correct, route accurate. I shook off the weird feeling and headed inside to the convenience store attached to the gas station, figuring I was just tired and my memory was playing tricks. The clerk behind the counter was a young guy, maybe 25, with dark circles under his eyes and the kind of exhausted expression you see on people working overnight shifts in places nobody wants to be. His name tag said Raya, which struck me as unusual, but I didn't give it much thought until I asked him how long he'd been on shift, and he looked at me with this hollow, confused expression before saying he didn't know. Maybe 19 hours, maybe longer. Time didn't seem to work right here, and did I know what year it was? I laughed because I thought he was joking, told him it was 2023, June specifically, and watched his face go pale. He asked me to repeat the date, then pulled out his phone and stared at the screen for a long moment before showing it to me. His phone's date read June 8th, 2023, but when he scrolled through his photo gallery, The most recent pictures were dated June 8th as well. Dozens of photos of the same sunrise, the same parking lot, the same 3 vehicles I'd noticed outside. He'd apparently been taking pictures to prove to himself that time was passing, but every image looked identical, as if the sun rose in exactly the same position every single morning and nothing ever changed. I should have left right then, should have climbed back in my truck and driven straight through to Baltimore without stopping. But something about the clerk's desperation made me stay and listen. He explained that he couldn't remember when his shift had started, only that he'd been at the truck stop for what felt like weeks, watching the same customers come and go, serving coffee that never ran out from pots that never emptied, ringing up purchases on a register that always showed the same total no matter what items were scanned. Other people were trapped too. The waitress at the diner had been working there since she couldn't remember when. The mechanic at the truck repair shop next door couldn't recall the last time he'd gone home. And the 3 vehicles in the parking lot belonged to travelers who'd stopped for gas and simply never left. I walked outside with Raya and approached the red pickup. Inside, a man sat behind the wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing, his hands on the steering wheel in a white-knuckle grip. I knocked on the window, and he didn't react, didn't even blink, just sat there, like a mannequin arranged in the driver's seat. The silver sedan was empty, but the engine was running, had apparently been running continuously, based on the way heat shimmered above the hood. And when I checked the gas gauge, it read full despite the motor burning fuel for however long the car had been trapped in this place. I found the motorcycle's owner inside the diner, a woman in her 50s wearing a leather jacket and boots, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours or days or weeks ago. When I asked her how long she'd been there, she looked at me with eyes that held no recognition of time passing, said she'd stopped for dinner and was waiting for her food, but the waitress kept forgetting her order. I looked at the waitress, a tired woman whose name tag identified her as Lou, and she was crying silently while pouring coffee for customers who all ordered the same thing and sat in the same booths and never seemed to finish their meals. Lou told me she remembered her first day working at the diner, remembered meeting the manager and learning the menu, but she couldn't remember anything between that first day and now, just an endless repetition of the same shift, the same orders, the same 4 hours that reset themselves like a loop in a broken recording. I returned to my truck and tried to leave, turned the key and put the transmission in gear, but every route I took circled back to the same truck stop. I drove east on the service road trying to merge onto I-76. Found myself pulling back into the parking lot from the west entrance. I tried north, south, different combinations of turns and exits, but every road led back to Breezewood, back to the fluorescent lights and the 3 vehicles that never moved and the clerk who couldn't remember when his shift had started. I checked my logbook and saw that hours had passed while I'd been trying to escape. It was now approaching 7 in the morning, according to my watch, but the sky remained the same dark pre-dawn gray it had been when I first arrived. I met another trucker in the parking lot, an older driver who introduced himself as Arthur and said he'd been trapped since 2019, that he'd stopped for fuel during a snowstorm, and when he tried to leave, every road just brought him back. He showed me his logbook, page after page of identical entries, same date repeated hundreds of times, same location, same notation that he was stuck and couldn't proceed with his delivery. Arthur explained that the loop reset at 3:33 in the morning. Everything rewound to that exact moment. The vehicles returned to their positions. The clerk forgot our previous conversations. The waitress started her shift over, and anyone who'd managed to hold on to memories from the previous loop found themselves the only ones who remembered. He'd been through the loop so many times he'd lost count, watching the same sunrise that never fully rose, serving the same 4 hours that never progressed to morning, trapped in a segment of time that repeated endlessly while the rest of the world moved forward without them. He showed me his journal where he'd documented everything. The loop lasted exactly 4 hours, from 3:33 until 7:33, then reset. During each loop, new travelers would arrive, get trapped, and join the collection of people stuck in Breezewood's temporal prison. Some people seem to fade after enough repetitions, becoming like the man in the red pickup, just empty shells going through motions without consciousness, while others, like Arthur, retained awareness, but slowly went mad from the repetition. I decided to try something different. When the loop reset at 3:33, I felt it happen, a sensation like the world hiccuping, everything flickering for just a moment. I immediately drove my truck toward the exit in complete darkness, turned off every light, drove blind using only memory of the road layout. I crashed through a barrier I hadn't seen, felt the truck lurch over rough terrain, kept driving with my eyes closed because Arthur had mentioned that the loop seemed to work by observing your location, tracking you through sight and surveillance systems. I drove for what felt like hours in darkness, crashed through fencing and scraped past obstacles, until finally I felt the road surface change beneath my tires, felt the truck reach actual highway pavement, and when I opened my eyes, I was on I-76 heading east with the sunrise. The real sunrise, bright and warm, coming up behind me. My GPS showed I'd somehow traveled 40 miles from Breezewood, though I had no memory of covering that distance. And when I looked in my mirrors, the interchange had vanished into early morning fog that seemed thicker than natural. I drove straight through to Baltimore without stopping again, delivered my load 12 hours late, and filed a report with my company, claiming mechanical problems had delayed me. I never told them the truth because who would believe it? But here's what haunts me. I later learned that Arthur's truck, the one registered to a driver who'd gone missing in 2019, was found abandoned at a Breezewood truck stop 3 days after I escaped. The truck was empty, no sign of Arthur, and according to the attendant who reported it, the vehicle had appeared overnight in a parking spot that had been empty the previous evening. I also discovered that Breezewood has an unusually high number of missing persons cases associated with it, travelers who stopped for gas or food and simply vanished. Their vehicles sometimes found days later, in the same parking lots where they'd been last seen. The cases remain unsolved, marked as voluntary disappearances or possible foul play. But I know better. I know that somewhere in Breezewood, in a segment of time that loops eternally between 3:33 and 7:33 in the morning, those missing people are still there, still trapped, still serving coffee and pumping gas, and sitting in their vehicles waiting for a morning that will never fully arrive. Could you drive through the same intersection twice and not realize you'd never actually left the first time? My name is Aida, and I made a terrible mistake when I accepted a freelance photography job in Confluence, Pennsylvania during September 2011. At the time, I was building my portfolio, taking whatever assignments came my way. And when the Confluence Chamber of Commerce contacted me about photographing their annual Uziagini River Harvest Festival, I jumped at the opportunity. The pay was decent. The festival sounded charming. Small-town Americana with craft vendors, local food, and traditional celebrations. And I needed the work badly enough that I didn't ask too many questions about what exactly I'd be photographing. I drove down from Erie on a Friday afternoon, the late September air thick with the smell of turning leaves and wood smoke, and checked into a bed and breakfast run by a friendly older woman who kept insisting I try her homemade apple butter and asking if I'd ever attended a harvest festival before. When I told her this was my first time in Confluence, her smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered and said I was in for a real treat, that the festival was something people remembered for the rest of their lives. The festival grounds sprawled across farmland just outside town, centered around a massive cornfield that had been partially harvested to create an elaborate maze. The maze was the festival's main attraction, with paths winding through 8-foot-tall corn stalks that rustled constantly in the breeze, creating a sound like whispered conversations. Scarecrows were positioned throughout the maze and around the festival grounds, dozens of them in various poses and costumes, some traditional with burlap sacks for heads, and others more elaborate with carved pumpkins or painted faces. My job was to capture the festival's atmosphere, Families enjoying the maze, children on hay rides, vendors selling preserves, and hand-carved wooden crafts, and especially the scarecrow display, which apparently was judged each year with prizes for the most creative designs. I spent Saturday photographing everything, filling memory cards with images of smiling faces and autumn colors, noticing how the locals seemed unusually attentive to the scarecrows, touching them gently as they passed, whispering to them, adjusting their clothing with a reverence that seemed excessive for simple decorations. Saturday evening, I met Landon, a farmer who'd lived in Confluence his entire life and whose family had been growing corn in the valley for 5 generations. He approached me near the corn maze entrance as I was changing camera lenses, introduced himself, and offered to show me the best locations for photographing the festival at sunrise, when the morning light turned the cornfield golden and created what he called the most beautiful conditions for capturing the true spirit of the celebration. He seemed nervous while speaking, his hands fidgeting with his jacket zipper, and he kept glancing toward the scarecrows as if checking to make sure they were still in their assigned positions. I accepted his offer because getting good sunrise shots would strengthen my portfolio, and we agreed to meet at the festival grounds before dawn on Sunday morning. That night, reviewing my photographs on my laptop at the bed and breakfast, I noticed something disturbing that I'd missed while shooting. In several images, the scarecrows had moved between shots. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable when comparing photos taken minutes apart. A scarecrow's head turned slightly, an arm raised that had been lowered, positions shifted by a few feet despite no one being near them when I'd pressed the shutter. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe festival volunteers repositioned them between my shots. Maybe wind had caused the movements. Maybe my memory of their original positions was faulty. But the unease settled into my stomach and stayed there, growing heavier as I zoomed in on the scarecrow faces in my images. The details were too precise, too anatomical. These weren't crude burlap sacks stuffed with straw. They were carefully constructed with features that looked disturbingly human, skin textures that appeared too realistic for paint or fabric. And in extreme close-ups, I could see what looked like real hair woven into the heads and fingernails on the gloved hands. I barely slept that night, listening to the wind outside my window and imagining I could hear corn stalks rustling even though the festival grounds were 2 miles away. Sunday morning arrived gray and cold, fog rolling through the valley and turning everything ghostly. I met Landon at the festival grounds at 5:30, the only 2 people there, and he led me into the corn maze with a flashlight to reach what he called the perfect vantage point for sunrise photography. As we walked deeper into the maze, he finally told me the truth, his voice barely above a whisper, words tumbling out like a confession he'd been holding back since we'd met. The harvest festival wasn't what it appeared to be. The scarecrows weren't decorations. Every year, the festival culminated in a ceremony on Sunday evening, where the community selected a harvest queen from among the young women who'd volunteered, and the queen was honored in a ritual that dated back to the town's founding in the 1790s. Landon's own sister had been harvest queen in 1987, and he watched her die, watched the community wrap her living body in corn husks and stake her in the field, watched as something in the soil, something that had been feeding the valley's prosperity for over 2 centuries, consumed her slowly, transforming her body into plant matter while keeping her consciousness intact, trapping her awareness inside a scarecrow form that would stand in the field until the corn was harvested and she was burned with the stalks. I stopped walking, my camera hanging forgotten around my neck, and stared at Landon in the dim pre-dawn light filtering through fog and corn stalks. He wasn't joking. His face held the expression of someone who'd witnessed horrors beyond comprehension and had spent decades trying to live with the memory. He explained that the ritual wasn't optional. The town's crops failed whenever they tried to stop. Livestock died. Children got sick with illnesses. Doctors couldn't diagnose, and economic disasters swept through the valley until the community resumed the sacrifices, The Harvest Queens were always volunteers in name, but the social pressure was immense, and families whose daughters refused were ostracized, driven out of town, or worse. He'd brought me into the maze because he wanted someone from outside Confluence to document what he was about to show me, to carry evidence beyond the valley, to maybe bring authorities who could stop what had been happening for generations. We reached the maze's center as the sun started rising, pale light turning the fog orange and gold, and there I saw them, the previous Harvest Queens. 20 or 30 scarecrows arranged in a circle, their bodies clearly not straw and fabric, but something that had once been human and had been transformed into horrible hybrid forms where flesh had become plant tissue, bones had become wood, and skin had developed the texture of corn husks. Some still had recognizable human features, eyes that tracked our movement, mouths frozen in silent screams, fingers that twitched slightly as we approached. Landon walked to one scarecrow in particular, touched her face gently, and whispered an apology. This was his sister, 24 years after her sacrifice, her consciousness still trapped inside the transformed body, aware but unable to speak or move beyond the slight gestures that proved she remained alive in some impossible way. I photographed everything with shaking hands, documenting the horror while trying not to vomit, capturing images that proved this wasn't art or elaborate decoration, but genuine human suffering preserved through means I couldn't understand. Landon said the ceremony would happen that evening at sunset, that this year's Harvest Queen had already been selected. A young woman who'd volunteered after her family's farm nearly went bankrupt last year, and the community had made clear that volunteering would ensure their financial recovery. He wanted me to photograph the ceremony, to capture evidence that couldn't be dismissed or ignored, and then help him go to authorities in Pittsburgh or Harrisburg, somewhere beyond the valley where the festival's influence couldn't reach. I agreed because what else could I do? But as we left the maze, we heard voices, festival volunteers arriving early to prepare for the final day's events. We separated, Landon heading to his truck and me returning to my car, agreeing to meet that evening before the ceremony began. I spent the day pretending to photograph normal festival activities while waiting for sunset, my stomach churning every time I saw the scarecrows, knowing now what they really were. Seeing the slight movements that proved consciousness remained inside those transformed bodies. When evening approached, the festival took on a different character. Vendors began packing up, families with young children left, and a crowd of locals gathered near the corn maze entrance with serious expressions and ceremonial clothing. I saw the Harvest Queen, a girl who couldn't have been more than 19, wearing a white dress and a crown woven from corn silk, her face painted with designs that looked pre-Columbian, walking toward the maze surrounded by festival organizers who sang in a language I didn't recognize. I photographed everything from a distance, using a telephoto lens to capture the procession entering the maze, and then I followed on foot, staying hidden in the corn rows while the ceremony proceeded. What I witnessed in the maze's center will haunt me forever. They staked the Harvest Queen in the ground at the circle's center, wrapped her body in fresh corn husks while she stood rigid and silent, either drugged or simply resigned to her fate. And then the elders began chanting while touching the soil around her feet. The ground opened, not cracked or split, but opened like a mouth, dark soil flowing like liquid, and something beneath reached up with tendrils that looked like roots, but moved with animal intent, wrapping around the queen's legs and pulling her down slowly while the corn husks began growing into her skin, fusing with her flesh, transforming her body even as she started screaming, a sound that cut off abruptly as the husks covered her mouth and her throat and her face, leaving only her eyes visible and filled with terror and agony. The transformation took less than 5 minutes, and when it finished, a new scarecrow stood in the circle, indistinguishable from the others except for the fresh corn silk hair and the eyes that still blinked and wept. I ran. I didn't wait for Landon, didn't stop to pack my equipment at the bed and breakfast, Just got in my car and drove out of Confluence as fast as I could manage on fog-shrouded mountain roads. I tried going to police in Somerset, showed them my photographs, and they looked at me like I was insane, suggested I digitally manipulated the images or photographed elaborate Halloween decorations. I tried newspapers, television stations, even posted some images online, and every single one was dismissed as art project or explained away as festival props. Landon never contacted me again. I learned 3 months later that he died in a farming accident, crushed by equipment that somehow activated while he was working alone. The official investigation found no evidence of foul play. I still have all the photographs locked in a safe deposit box, images that clearly show human faces trapped in scarecrow bodies, documentation of the Harvest Queen's transformation, proof that something impossible and evil has been operating in Confluence for generations. But proof means nothing when nobody will believe it. And I've learned that some communities protect their darkness with such commitment that outsiders can't penetrate the wall of denial. I left freelance photography after that. Couldn't bring myself to take another assignment in rural Pennsylvania, and I moved out of state within a year because I kept dreaming about cornfields and hearing whispers in languages I didn't understand. Every September, when harvest season arrives, I taste corn silk on the back of my tongue and feel phantom roots wrapping around my ankles. And I wonder how many other small towns have similar secrets, similar rituals, similar sacrifices hidden beneath festivals that tourists photograph without ever understanding what they're really seeing. If you discovered your town's prosperity came from something unspeakable, would you expose it, knowing everyone you love might turn against you? My name is Austin, and I work as a real estate appraiser throughout eastern Pennsylvania, evaluating properties for banks and mortgage companies who need objective assessments before financing deals. In February 2020, just before the world shut down for reasons none of us could have anticipated, I received an assignment to inspect a row of abandoned slate millworker houses in Slatedale, a tiny community in Lehigh County that barely appears on most maps. The houses had been empty since the 1970s when the slate quarries closed and the workers moved away, seeking employment elsewhere, leaving behind these identical two-story structures built in the 1880s to house the immigrant laborers who extracted roofing slate from the massive quarries that scarred the hillsides. The bank wanted appraisals because a developer was considering purchasing the entire row for renovation into vacation rentals, capitalizing on the growing interest in industrial heritage tourism. I drove out on a Tuesday morning, the February sky heavy and gray, frost still clinging to the grass along Route 873, where the old workers' houses stood in a line like crooked teeth, their windows broken and walls stained with decades of weather damage. The first house I entered seemed structurally sound despite the neglect, with original hardwood floors and plaster walls that showed water damage but no serious foundation issues. I measured rooms, photographed damage, took notes on my tablet about necessary repairs, working through the ground floor systematically before climbing the stairs to inspect the second level. That's when I noticed something wrong with the layout. According to the exterior dimensions I'd measured, the upstairs should have contained 3 bedrooms and a small bathroom. But when I walked the hallway, I found 4 doors where there should have been 3, and the spaces they opened into didn't correspond to the building's footprint. The first bedroom was normal, roughly 12 by 10 feet, but the second door opened into a room that felt larger inside than the house's exterior walls could possibly contain. I measured it twice, 16 by 18 feet, which meant the room extended beyond where the building's outer wall should be. Yet when I looked out the window, I saw the alley between houses at the correct distance, no extension visible from outside. I moved to the third house in the row, thinking maybe I'd miscalculated the exterior dimensions, but the same impossible geometry repeated itself. Rooms connected in ways that violated spatial logic. I entered a door from the upstairs hallway, walked through a bedroom, opened a door that should have led to a closet, and found myself in the downstairs kitchen despite never having descended stairs. I tried retracing my steps, went back through the door I'd just used, and emerged in a different upstairs bedroom than the one I'd entered. My sense of direction, usually reliable after years of walking through buildings, professionally failed completely. I'd enter the same door 3 times in a row and each time emerge in a completely different room, first a bathroom, then a pantry, then somehow back in the street outside the house. The spaces folded in on themselves in ways that hurt to think about, and after an hour of trying to make sense of the layout, I gave up on the 3rd house and moved to the 4th, hoping for normalcy. Instead, I found spaces that shouldn't exist. Between the exterior walls, in areas that appeared solid from outside, I discovered rooms with no connection to the rest of the house's structure. A staircase that descended from a 2nd-floor closet led down into darkness that continued far below where the basement should be. A hallway extended 40 feet in a direction where the neighboring house stood only 15 feet away. Yet somehow, both houses existed in the same physical space without intersecting. I pulled up the property's architectural plans on my tablet, original blueprints from 1886 filed with the county, and they showed normal, conventional layouts that bore no resemblance to what I was experiencing. Either the houses had been radically altered after construction in ways that defied physics, or something fundamental about their spatial properties had never been normal to begin with. In the 5th house, I found a journal in a desk drawer that had survived decades of abandonment. The entries were dated 1924, written by a quarry worker whose handwriting suggested minimal formal education, but whose observations were disturbingly precise. He described how the quarry company had blasted into a new seam of slate in the spring of that year, following a vein of particularly high-quality rock deeper into the hillside than they'd previously excavated. The slate from that deeper level had unusual properties. It fractured along angles that didn't exist in normal geometry. Its surface reflected light in ways that caused headaches and disorientation, and workers who handled it for extended periods reported spatial confusion and temporal displacement. The writer mentioned that the company doctor attributed these effects to methane exposure or simple exhaustion, but the workers knew better. They'd release something when they broke through into that deep seam, something that bent space wrong, and the effects had spread to the houses built from slate quarried from that level. The journal ended abruptly in August 1924 with an entry that said the writer could no longer find his way to his own bedroom. The doors led to places they hadn't led the day before, and that he'd decided to leave Slatedale before the house's impossible geometry trapped him permanently. I should have left immediately after reading that journal, should have called the bank and told them the property was unsuitable for appraisal, but professional pride and curiosity kept me investigating. I wanted to document the spatial anomalies, to understand the pattern if there was one, to find some rational explanation even as the evidence mounted that no rational explanation existed. In the 6th house, I experienced severe disorientation. Gravity seemed to pull in wrong directions. Walls appeared to shift angles when I wasn't looking directly at them, and floors tilted in ways that made walking difficult even though my level showed they were perfectly horizontal. I turned a corner and found myself walking on what had been the wall, the floor now vertical beside me, furniture hanging at impossible angles. The sensation of wrongness was so intense I vomited, my inner ear screaming that reality had broken, and my sense of up and down no longer corresponded to what my eyes showed me. That's when I encountered Journée. She sat in what appeared to be a bedroom in the 7th house, though I couldn't remember climbing stairs or entering a new building, as if the houses had merged into a single continuous space where navigation followed rules I didn't understand. She was young, maybe early 20s, wearing a police uniform that identified her as Slatedale Township Police, and she looked at me with eyes that held recognition and relief. She'd been trapped in the houses since 2008, she said, had entered to investigate a reported trespasser, and had never been able to find her way out. 12 years she'd wandered these connected impossible spaces, sometimes encountering other lost explorers, teenage hikers who'd broken in on a dare in 2015, a homeless man seeking shelter who'd arrived in 2011, a county building inspector who'd tried to evaluate the structures in 2013. None of them could escape. The doorways that should have led outside opened into more interior rooms. Staircases descended into spaces that existed between floors, and the geometry shifted constantly, so that maps drawn one day were useless the next. Journée showed me her phone, still clutched in her hand, though long dead. Its last photos showing normal house interiors, taken just before the spatial properties trapped her. She'd tried everything to escape, breaking through walls only to find more walls behind them, following what should have been exit routes that looped back to starting points, even attempting to stay in one room and wait for rescue that never came because, from the outside, the houses appeared empty and abandoned. Time moved strangely in the impossible spaces, too. She'd experienced what felt like 12 years, but her uniform showed no signs of aging. Her hair hadn't grown, her body hadn't changed. It was as if she'd been preserved in temporal stasis while remaining conscious, experiencing every moment of 12 subjective years that had somehow passed in the blink of external time. I knew I had to escape immediately before the house's geometry claimed me permanently, like it had claimed Journée and the others. I remembered the journal's mention of the deep slate, how it bent space wrong, and I realized that the house's spatial properties might respond to observation. They shifted when you weren't paying attention, but maybe holding your attention elsewhere could allow movement through normal space. I closed my eyes completely, blocking all visual input, and started walking based purely on memory of where the exit should be relative to where I'd entered. Without sight, my other senses became sharper. I heard wind coming from a direction that suggested an exterior opening, felt temperature gradients that indicated proximity to outside air, smelled the difference between interior dust and exterior atmosphere. I walked blind through what felt like dozens of rooms, climbed stairs and descended them, turned corners that my memory insisted shouldn't exist, and finally felt cold February air on my face. When I opened my eyes, I stood outside the row of houses, my car visible 50 yards away, exactly where I'd parked it hours earlier. I ran to my car without looking back, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove away from Slatedale, doing 20 miles over the speed limit until I reached the interstate. I called the bank from a rest stop and told them the property was too dangerous to appraise, that structural instability made the buildings unsafe for entry, and that I recommended condemning the entire row. I didn't mention the spatial anomalies because who would believe me? I filed a police report about Journée, said I'd encountered evidence that a missing officer might be trapped in the abandoned buildings, and provided her name and the date she'd mentioned. The state police investigated, found nothing, and told me there was no record of any Slatedale Township officer by that name going missing in 2008 or any other year. 2 weeks later, I returned to Slatedale with the most sophisticated surveying equipment I could rent, planning to document the impossible geometry with laser measurements and 3D scanning technology that would provide irrefutable proof. But when I arrived, the houses appeared completely normal. Rooms matched their exterior dimensions, doors led to expected spaces. Staircases went only where staircases should go. I spent 6 hours measuring every inch of the interiors, and everything corresponded perfectly to the 1886 blueprints. The journal I'd found was gone, the desk drawer empty. Photographs I'd taken during my first visit showed normal rooms with conventional layouts. No spatial distortions visible. Either I'd experienced some kind of breakdown or hallucination, or the house's properties were selective, revealing themselves only to certain people under certain conditions, and my return with measurement equipment and skeptical intent had been enough to make them hide their true nature. I filed my appraisal report showing the buildings as structurally sound with normal layouts, and the developer purchased the entire row that spring. I heard later that renovation work began in summer 2023, but was abandoned after construction workers reported severe disorientation and spatial confusion. The project was canceled, the developer went bankrupt, and the houses remain empty to this day, slowly collapsing into ruin while whatever bent their space wrong continues to exist in the slate quarried from too deep in the hillside. I never took another appraisal job in Lehigh County, and I still have nightmares about impossible rooms and stairs that lead nowhere and doorways that open into spaces that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I wake up disoriented, unsure which direction is truly up, and I have to stand in the center of my bedroom, touching walls to confirm that they're positioned where walls belong, and that I haven't slipped back into geometry that obeys different rules than the reality the rest of us share. When you walk through your own home in the dark, do you ever worry the hallway might lead somewhere different than it did yesterday? My name is Milani, and I've worked the late shift at Route 120 Diner in Emporium, Pennsylvania for 3 years, serving coffee and pie to truckers and state police who patrol the empty highways through Cameron County at hours when most people are safely asleep in their beds. August 2017 was brutally hot, the kind of humid Pennsylvania summer where the asphalt stays warm even at midnight, and moths swarmed the fluorescent lights outside the diner in clouds so thick they look like fog. I was scheduled alone on August 23rd, a Wednesday, which meant handling both waitressing and the register, while Adriel, our night cook, worked the grill in back. The diner sat on a lonely stretch of Route 120 between Emporium and Cinnamahoning, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides and a gravel parking lot that could hold maybe 20 vehicles, but rarely saw more than 5 on any given night. We got regular customers, truckers running loads between Interstate 80 and Route 6, hunters during season, occasional travelers who'd gotten lost trying to find shortcuts through the Allegheny Mountains, but mostly the shifts were quiet. Just Adriel and me cleaning equipment and restocking supplies while waiting for headlights to sweep across the parking lot, announcing someone who needed food or just wanted company during the long, dark hours when loneliness hits hardest. The last regular customer left around 11, a trucker I recognized who always ordered the meatloaf special and left exactly $3 for a tip. Adriel locked himself in the kitchen to deep clean the fryer, a job he hated, but that needed doing before a health inspector showed up next week, which left me alone in the front dining area wiping down tables and refilling napkin dispensers while the radio played classic country music at low volume. At 11:45, headlights cut across the front windows, and a pickup truck pulled into the lot, parking at an angle that blocked the main entrance in a way that immediately made me uncomfortable. The driver sat in the cab for maybe 2 minutes before getting out, long enough that I'd started wondering if he was drunk or sick. And when he finally entered the diner, I felt my stomach tighten with instinctive unease. He wore hunting camouflage despite it being late August and nowhere near deer season, heavy boots that tracked mud across the clean floor I'd just mopped, and a baseball cap pulled low enough to shadow his face. He sat at the counter rather than a booth, which meant he'd be directly across from me while I worked. And when I approached with a menu and coffee pot, he waved away the menu and asked for just black coffee, his voice flat and emotionless in a way that suggested someone working very hard to sound normal. I poured his coffee and retreated to the far end of the counter, pretending to organize receipts while keeping him in my peripheral vision. He didn't drink the coffee, just wrapped both hands around the mug and stared at it, and after maybe 5 minutes of silence, he spoke without looking up. Said something about how it was good hunting weather, how the heat made animals move differently, how they got careless when they were thirsty and desperate. I made non-committal sounds of agreement while my brain screamed that something was very wrong with this entire situation. His truck blocked the entrance. Adriel was locked in the kitchen, with the fryer running loud enough that he wouldn't hear anything happening in the dining area. The nearest other business was a gas station 3 miles west that closed at 10. Route 120 was empty at this hour. No traffic, no witnesses, just dark highway stretching through forest in both directions. I checked my phone discreetly, saw it was almost midnight, and decided to close early to tell this man we were shutting down and he needed to leave. But when I started to speak, he looked directly at me for the first time, and his eyes held something cold and predatory that froze the words in my throat. He said he knew what I was thinking, knew I wanted to close early, but he suggested I reconsider because he'd driven a long way, specifically to visit this diner tonight, and it would be rude to turn away a customer who'd made such an effort. The way he emphasized the word customer made it clear he was talking about something other than pie and coffee. And when he stood up from the counter stool, I saw the hunting knife sheathed on his belt, easily 8 inches of blade designed for field dressing deer, but equally effective on other prey. He walked to the front door and locked it from the inside, flipped the closed sign to face outward, then returned to the counter, moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this before, someone who knew exactly how the next hour would unfold because he'd rehearsed it in previous diners with previous waitresses who'd been working alone on empty highways where screams didn't carry far enough to matter. He told me to sit in the booth nearest the kitchen door, to put my hands on the table where he could see them, and to listen carefully because he was only going to explain the rules once. I sat because running seemed impossible with him between me and the exits, and because some desperate part of my brain insisted that compliance might buy time, might create an opening for escape if I stayed calm and watched for opportunities. He explained that he'd been hunting along Route 120 for 3 years, selecting lone workers at isolated locations, targeting people nobody would miss immediately, and whose disappearances could be attributed to them simply quitting their jobs and moving away. He'd killed 7 people, he said, speaking about it with the same casual tone someone might use to describe a hobby like fishing or woodworking. 3 waitresses, 2 gas station attendants, a motel clerk, and a hitchhiker who'd been unlucky enough to accept a ride. He kept souvenirs from each one, photographs and personal items stored in a lockbox under his truck seat, and he chose his hunting grounds carefully. Always rural Pennsylvania, always late-night shifts, always locations where police response times exceeded 30 minutes and where the local departments were too understaffed to conduct serious investigations into missing persons cases that might just be people who'd chosen to leave town. While he talked, I noticed the kitchen had gone silent. The fryer's rumble had stopped, which meant Adriel had finished cleaning and would be coming out soon to tell me he was heading home. And when that door opened, this man would kill him without hesitation, because witnesses complicated hunts. I had maybe 2 minutes before Adriel appeared, 2 minutes to create some kind of advantage, to change the situation from helpless victim to something else. The man was still talking, explaining how he chose victims based on their isolation and vulnerability, how he'd watched me for weeks before deciding tonight was the right time. And while he spoke, I slowly moved my right hand toward the edge of the table where I'd set down the coffee pot when he'd ordered me to sit. The pot was still half full and had been sitting on the burner for 2 hours, hot enough to burn skin on contact. When Adriel pushed through the kitchen door, wiping his hands on a towel and asking if I wanted him to take out the trash before leaving, the man in hunting gear spun toward the sudden noise, his hand dropping to the knife on his belt, and I grabbed the coffee pot and threw the contents directly at his face. The screaming started immediately, his hands flying to his eyes, while scalding liquid ran down his neck and soaked into his shirt, and I yelled at Adriel to run, to get to his car and drive, to call police from somewhere safe down the highway. Adriel stood frozen for maybe 3 seconds trying to process what he was seeing before his survival instinct kicked in and he bolted back through the kitchen toward the rear exit. The man stumbled toward the counter, still screaming, and I grabbed the first weapon I could reach, a heavy glass sugar dispenser, and brought it down on the back of his head hard enough that it shattered and he dropped to his knees. I ran for the kitchen, slipped on coffee that had splashed across the floor, caught myself on a table edge, and made it through the swinging door before he could recover enough to follow. The kitchen's back door hung open where Adriel had fled, and I ran into the parking lot in time to see Adriel's car taillights disappearing down Route 120 heading east. My own car was parked on the far side of the lot, too far to reach before the man recovered. So I did the only thing I could think of and ran into the forest, crashing through underbrush in the dark, while behind me I heard the diner's back door slam open and boots on gravel. I'm not sure how long I ran through those woods. It felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes, stumbling over roots and pushing through branches that scraped my face and arms, my waitress uniform snagging on thorns, my sneakers soaking through in a stream I splashed across without slowing. Eventually, I saw lights through the trees. The gas station 3 miles west that I'd thought was closed, but apparently stayed open later on weekends. And I stumbled out of the forest into their parking lot, covered in scratches and mud, crying so hard I could barely explain to the night attendant that someone had attacked me, and I needed them to call police immediately. State police arrived within 15 minutes, and I rode with them back to the diner, where they found my attacker's truck still in the parking lot, but no sign of him. Inside the diner, coffee and broken glass covered the floor, along with blood from where I'd hit him with the sugar dispenser. And when police searched his truck, they found exactly what he'd described. A lockbox containing photographs of 7 people, driver's licenses and wallets, a journal documenting dates and locations with clinical precision, and a collection of hunting knives in various sizes, some still stained with substances forensics would later confirm as human blood. The man himself vanished into the forests around Emporium and was never found despite extensive searches involving dogs and helicopters and teams of officers who combed through thousands of acres of wilderness. 7 missing persons cases were solved through the evidence in his truck. 3 waitresses from diners in Potter and Cameron counties, 2 gas station workers, a motel clerk from Renovo, and a young man whose hitchhiking trip had ended somewhere along Route 120 in 2015. All of them matched the timeline and descriptions in his journal, and forensic evidence confirmed their DNA on items in the lockbox. But without a body or a suspect in custody, the cases remained technically open. Police theorized he died in the forest from injuries I'd inflicted or from exposure, but searches never found remains, and I've never felt certain he was really gone. I left Pennsylvania entirely within 3 months, moved to Ohio, and took a job working day shift at a corporate restaurant where I'd never be alone, where security cameras covered every angle, where dozens of people surrounded me during every shift. I still can't sleep with the lights off, still check the locks on my doors multiple times before bed, still scan parking lots for trucks that remind me of his vehicle. Adriel called me once, 6 months after that night, said he'd quit the diner and moved to Pittsburgh. Couldn't handle working nights anymore. Couldn't stop seeing that man's face every time someone walked through the door. We talked for an hour about the what-ifs. What if I hadn't grabbed the coffee pot? What if Adriel had come out 30 seconds earlier? What if I'd tried to run instead of fighting? But there are no answers to those questions. Just the knowledge that we survived something 7 other people hadn't, and that somewhere in Pennsylvania, a predator who chose lone workers on empty highways might still be hunting or might be bones scattered in Allegheny Forest where they'll never be identified. Either way, his hunting grounds remain, and other people still work those isolated night shifts at diners and gas stations along routes like 120, making themselves vulnerable to whatever darkness drives on those roads looking for prey. What would you do if you realized the stranger sitting across from you had come specifically hunting you tonight? My name is Damien, and I've worked as a paramedic in Somerset County, Pennsylvania for 11 years, responding to everything from car accidents on the turnpike to heart attacks in rural farmhouses where the nearest hospital is 40 minutes away, even with lights and sirens running. January 2024 brought one of the worst winter storms I'd ever seen. Snow falling so heavily that visibility dropped to near zero, and roads became impassable, even for our emergency vehicles equipped with chains and four-wheel drive. On January 15th, dispatch sent me and my partner on a wellness check to a residence on the outskirts of Somerset proper, an older neighborhood where houses sat on large lots with significant distance between them, and where elderly residents living alone sometimes went days without contact with neighbors or family. The call came from a concerned niece in Pittsburgh who hadn't been able to reach her Aunt Harley by phone for 3 days and wanted someone to verify she was safe and had adequate heating during the storm that had dumped nearly 2 feet of snow across the region and showed no signs of stopping. We arrived at the address just after 2 in the afternoon, though the heavy gray sky made it feel closer to dusk, and found a modest single-story home with dark windows and a driveway that hadn't been plowed or shoveled since the snow started falling. No smoke came from the chimney, no lights visible inside, and when we knocked on the front door, we got no response. I tried the knob and found it unlocked, which was common in rural Pennsylvania, where people still trusted their neighbors and rarely bothered with security systems or even locking doors when they ran to the store. We called out as we entered, identifying ourselves as paramedics responding to a wellness check, and the temperature inside the house hit me immediately. It couldn't have been more than 40 degrees, cold enough to see our breath, suggesting the heating system had failed or been turned off days ago. We found Harley in the living room, sitting in a rocking chair, positioned directly in front of the large picture window that overlooked her backyard. She was unresponsive, but breathing, her skin cold to the touch but not hypothermic yet, dressed in layers of sweaters and wrapped in blankets that suggested she'd been trying to stay warm despite the failing heat. Her eyes were open, fixed on the window with an intensity that made me check her pupils for signs of strokes or neurological event, but they reacted normally to light, and her vital signs, while concerning, didn't indicate immediate medical emergency. What disturbed me more was her complete lack of response to our presence. She didn't blink when I spoke directly to her, didn't react when I touched her shoulder, just continued staring out that window as if she was watching something so compelling that nothing else in the world mattered. I looked out the window to see what had captured her attention so completely, and felt my stomach drop. The backyard should have been covered in uniform white snow, undisturbed except for maybe animal tracks or branches that had fallen during the storm. Instead, in the center of the yard, roughly 30 feet from the house, there was a perfect circle of bare ground, approximately 15 feet in diameter. No snow had accumulated in that circle, despite the storm continuing to dump heavy flakes everywhere else, and the exposed earth appeared dark and slightly wet, as if recently disturbed, or as if something beneath the surface was generating enough heat to melt snow on contact. I called for my partner to look, and we stood together at the window, trying to find a rational explanation, maybe a geothermal vent, maybe a broken sewer line leaking warm water, maybe some kind of chemical contamination that prevented snow accumulation. But none of those explanations felt right, because as we watched, the ground in that circle moved. Not dramatically, not like something erupting or breaking through, just subtle movement like the earth was breathing, rising and falling by maybe an inch or two, and with each rise, I swear I saw impressions forming in the soil, dozens of small depressions appearing and disappearing as if something underneath was pressing upward against the frozen ground, trying to break through. My partner saw it too, confirmed I wasn't hallucinating or misinterpreting shadows, and we both turned back to Harley, who continued her unresponsive staring, and I noticed for the first time that her lips were moving slightly, forming words without sound. And when I leaned close enough to hear, she was counting in a whisper so faint I almost missed it. 206, 207, 208. Just numbers in sequence with no context or explanation. I made the decision to transport her immediately, to get her away from this house and whatever was happening in that backyard. But when I tried to lift her from the rocking chair, Harley suddenly grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and spoke in a clear, coherent voice that contrasted sharply with her previous unresponsiveness. She said she'd been watching them try to dig out since 1987, that she couldn't look away because the moment she stopped watching, they made progress, that her vigilance was the only thing keeping them contained beneath the earth where they belonged. I asked her who she was talking about, what was under her backyard, and she explained with the patience of someone who'd spent decades thinking about how to describe something impossible. The old cemetery that had bordered her property until the 1980s had collapsed into an abandoned coal mine shaft in 1987, a catastrophic subsidence event that swallowed over 200 graves and dropped them into darkness hundreds of feet below the surface. The county had relocated the cemetery, reinterred the remains they could recover, and sold her property at a discount because of its proximity to the collapse zone. But not all the graves had been recovered, and not all the dead had stayed buried. She released my wrist and returned to staring out the window while continuing her whispered count, and I looked back at the circle of bare ground in time to see what she'd been watching. Pale fingers, dozens of them, were pushing up through the dark soil, scraping at the frozen earth from below, moving with the slow persistence of things that had been trying to reach the surface for 37 years and had finally gotten close enough to almost break through. The fingers appeared and disappeared as the ground rose and fell, sometimes individual hands, sometimes multiple hands clustered together, and they left scratch marks in the dirt, furrows that suggested desperate clawing, attempts to widen the openings enough for entire bodies to emerge. I felt my professional detachment shatter, felt the paramedic training that insisted on rational explanations and evidence-based treatment crumble in the face of something that couldn't exist, but was happening right in front of me. My partner had already retreated to the ambulance to call for backup, to report what we were seeing to dispatch, even though he knew they'd think he was having a breakdown. And I stayed with Harley because leaving her alone felt wrong, even though everything else about this situation violated every assumption I'd built my career on. I asked her why she hadn't called for help, why she'd sat here for days watching this happen without alerting authorities or neighbors, and she laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it, and explained that she'd tried in 1987, tried in 1995 when they first started reaching toward the surface, tried again in 2003 and 2011, and every few years, when the activity increased, police came, looked at her backyard, saw nothing unusual, and suggested she was experiencing dementia or grief-related hallucinations. She'd learned that some things only revealed themselves to certain people, that watching for decades had changed her in ways that allowed her to perceive what others couldn't, and that her niece's call for a wellness check was actually the worst thing that could have happened, because it meant Harley would be removed from her post, would be taken to a hospital or nursing facility, and her backyard would go unwatched for the first time in 37 years. She was right about being removed. My partner returned with a supervisor, who'd driven out despite the storm, and they made the decision to transport Harley for evaluation and treatment for hypothermia and possible altered mental status. I tried explaining what I'd seen, tried getting them to look at the backyard, but the circle of bare ground had filled with snow again, appeared completely normal, and when I pointed out where the fingers had been breaking through, there was nothing but undisturbed white surface. They looked at me with the same concerned expressions I'd seen them use, with patients experiencing psychotic breaks, and I realized how I sounded, realized I had no evidence beyond my own testimony, and that continuing to insist I'd seen the dead trying to claw their way out of a collapsed mine shaft would end my career faster than any mistake I could make in the field. We loaded Harley into the ambulance, and she went quietly, not fighting or protesting, just turning her head to keep the window in view as long as possible, while continuing to count under her breath, and her final words, before we closed the doors, were directed at me specifically. She said they were almost through now, that 37 years of patient digging had brought them within inches of the surface, that her watching had slowed them but never stopped them, and that by spring, when the ground thawed, Somerset would understand what happened when you buried people in earth that couldn't hold them and expected them to stay down forever. We transported her to Somerset Hospital, where she was admitted for observation, and I filed my report describing the wellness check and her hypothermic condition without mentioning anything about the backyard, because I wanted to keep my job and my reputation. Harley died during transport, her heart simply stopping despite our resuscitation efforts, as if the moment she was removed from her vigil, she had no reason to continue living. Her final word, spoken so quietly I almost didn't hear it over the ambulance equipment, was a number, 243, the last in whatever count she'd been keeping all these years. I returned to her house the next day during my off shift, parked down the street, and walked through the snow to look at her backyard one more time. The entire yard had collapsed overnight, a sinkhole roughly 40 feet in diameter that dropped into darkness too deep for my flashlight to penetrate, and scattered around the edge of the collapse, partially covered by fresh snow, were pieces of coffins, scraps of burial clothing, and bones that didn't look like they'd been underground for 37 years because they were still moving, still trying to pull themselves up out of the earth, even without flesh or muscle to animate them. Somerset County officials cordoned off the area, brought in geological survey teams, and determined that the 1987 mine collapse had been more extensive than originally documented, that Harley's entire neighborhood sat above unstable ground, and that the recent heavy snow had triggered secondary collapses throughout the region. Over 200 graves were discovered in the newly opened shaft, coffins stacked at various depths, some broken open, some empty despite burial records indicating they should have contained remains. The official explanation involved water erosion and animal activity, and natural processes that relocated remains over decades, but I know what I saw, and I know that Harley spent 37 years watching something impossible, keeping count of how many were trying to return, and that when her vigil ended, they finally succeeded. I requested a transfer to a different county within a month, couldn't continue working in Somerset knowing what lay beneath the ground, and I never took another wellness check call for elderly residents living alone because I'm terrified of what I might find them watching through their windows. Sometimes I still hear Harley's voice counting in my dreams, the numbers getting higher and higher, and I wonder if she's still counting wherever she is now, still keeping track of how many have emerged and how many remain below, waiting for their chance to dig toward the surface and reclaim the world they left behind. When you look out your window at night, do you ever wonder what might be looking back from the darkness, or what might be waiting just beneath your feet for the right moment to rise? That concludes our journey through Pennsylvania's darkest small-town secrets. These 9 stories remind us that horror doesn't need cities to thrive. It flourishes in quiet places where everyone knows your name but nobody speaks the truth. If these tales disturbed you, hit that like button and subscribe to Unheard Fears for more true horror from America's Forgotten Corners. Drop your own unexplained experiences in the comments below. Until next time, stay vigilant